In this video, you'll see how to evaluate third-party resources with AWS Config. With AWS Config, you can create rules to audit configurations of third-party resources to verify compliance with your organization's policies and guidelines. Let's navigate to AWS Config to get started. AWS Config is a service that enables you to assess, audit, and evaluate the configurations of your resources. Now you can perform configuration audit and compliance verification for third-party resources, such as GitHub repositories, Microsoft Active Directory resources, or any on-premises server, just like you do for AWS resources. As an example, we'll review a custom solution that will monitor a GitHub account to ensure the repositories are private. First, let's check the privacy status of two repositories in GitHub. We can see that both repositories are set to private. Next, let's view the private GitHub resource type in AWS CloudFormation. Public resource providers are those provided by AWS to manage specific AWS service resources. Private resource providers are those resource providers that you have explicitly registered for use in your AWS account. These may be resource providers you've created yourself, as well as ones shared with you. In this case, we only want to see the private resources in the CloudFormation registry. By registering a third-party resource in CloudFormation, you can validate data against a defined resource schema to ensure it is compliant and consistent. This resource type defines the schema for a GitHub repository. Next, let's navigate to AWS Lambda to view the Lambda functions that retrieve and validate data and evaluate compliance of our resources. First, let's view the details of the GitHub connector function, which connects GitHub and AWS Config. A CloudWatch event triggers this function to execute on a predefined schedule. This function retrieves the repository configuration from GitHub, transforms it to match the registered schema, and sends it to AWS Config. Notice that the code references the CloudFormation resource type we saw earlier. The code also retrieves the GitHub access token from AWS Secrets Manager. Next, let's verify that the Identity and Access Management, or IAM, execution rule used by this function provides the necessary permissions. The basic policy provides standard Lambda execution permissions, and the custom policy provides additional permissions. Let's view the details of the custom policy. The custom policy provides permissions to read the GitHub access keys stored in AWS Secrets Manager, to get the schema version for the resource in AWS CloudFormation, and to update and delete resource configurations in AWS Config. Together, the basic and custom policies provide the IAM execution role with the appropriate permissions. Now, let's return to AWS Lambda to review the other function. The GitHub repository private rule function evaluates whether a GitHub repository is compliant with a config rule. Let's copy the Amazon resource name, or ARN, for this function, because we'll need it later to create an AWS config rule that references this function. Here we can see that this function designates private repositories as compliant and public repositories as non-compliant. Now let's view resources imported into AWS Config using these functions. On the Resources screen, you can see that a new category is now available to filter resources on. These resources were imported into AWS Config using the GitHub connector Lambda function we looked at earlier. Let's filter the resource category to sample.org. Let's take a look at the details for the first resource that was discovered. The resource timeline shows changes to resource configuration and compliance over time. You can also review all the configuration details for this repository that were imported from GitHub. Now let's create a new AWS config rule to evaluate whether these repositories are private. The first step is to specify the rule type. In this case, we'll create a custom rule. The second step is to configure the rule. We'll provide a name and description for the rule. Next, we'll paste the ARN we copied earlier for the Lambda function that evaluates compliance. AWS Config evaluates resources based on a trigger. We'll specify the trigger as a change to the resource configuration. Next, we'll specify the third-party resource for this rule. The third step is to review the configurations and add the rule. After we refresh the screen, the rule shows as compliant because both GitHub repositories are private. So that we can test this further, let's return to GitHub and make one of the repositories public. Let's acknowledge the warning to make this repository public. Now let's return to AWS Config to re-evaluate if the resource configuration complies with our rule. After a few minutes, we can refresh the page to see the updated results. We can see the rule now shows as non-compliant. Let's look at the rule details to check the compliance for each resource. As expected, the rule identified the repository set to public as a non-compliant resource. You've just seen how to evaluate third-party resources with AWS Config. Thanks for watching. Now it's your turn to try.